The scent of fresh flowers still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of the cake and the perfume of my guests as they began to leave. My cheeks hurt from smiling for hours. My feet throbbed inside the delicate satin shoes, but my chest felt tight for a reason I could not name. The music played softly now, fading into the background as the laughter and chatter grew more distant. I was still in my wedding dress, the white fabric brushing against my legs with each step, when I felt it, that quiet, suffocating shift in the air, the way the energy of a room can change without a single word being spoken. The corridor was dim, lit only by the dying glow of a few wall lamps, their light stretching long shadows across the worn beige walls. The noise of the reception was muffled here, as though I had stepped into a different world entirely. In my hand, I still clutched the bouquet, the flowers slightly bruised from hours of holding them. They had been a gift from my aunt, carefully wrapped in ribbon, a small piece of beauty that now felt strangely out of place. I could hear my own breathing, slow and shallow, and behind it the sound of footsteps, steady, purposeful, drawing closer. When I turned my head slightly, I saw him, Richard, my husband. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression I did not recognize. There was no warmth in his eyes, no trace of the man who had kissed me at the altar just hours earlier. Instead, there was something cold, calculating, and unyielding. Before I could speak, his hand closed around my arm. It was not the gentle touch of a lover, but the firm, unrelenting grip of possession. My skin prickled under his fingers, and I could feel the pressure of each knuckle digging into me through the delicate lace of my sleeve. He leaned in, close enough for me to smell the mix of cologne and the bitter tang of wine on his breath. His voice was low, almost calm, but laced with something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. "Being a wife comes with obligations," he said, each word deliberate, as though testing how they would sound in the air. In that moment, I understood that something irreversible had happened. The Richard that I thought I knew was gone. This was someone else. Someone who looked at me not as a partner, but as property. My mind scrambled for logic, for some way to explain away the sudden shift. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the stress of the day had gotten to him. I told myself anything that could keep the growing dread at bay. But deep down, in a place I could not yet admit to myself, I knew. I knew the man who had promised to love me in front of God and everyone we cared about had just shown me a truth I was never meant to see. The corridor seemed to narrow around me. I could feel the rough texture of the wall at my back, the faint hum of the air conditioning somewhere in the distance, the coolness of the tiled floor seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. He did not move for several seconds, just held me there, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to measure the level of my compliance. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the last fading notes of music from the reception hall. When his grip finally loosened, it was not out of kindness. It was a release filled with silent warning, a reminder that from this moment on, the rules had changed. I stood there, bouquet still in my hand, my fingers trembling. As he walked back toward the room where our guests had been, I stayed frozen, unable to follow. Something inside me had shifted, a small crack forming in the image of the life I thought I was stepping into. The warmth of the evening, the laughter, the dancing, all of it had evaporated, leaving only the echo of his words and the weight of what they meant. The rest of that night passed in a haze. I remember the clinking of glasses, the polite goodbyes, the flash of the camera as friends tried to capture moments I already wanted to forget. I remember smiling when I was supposed to, laughing at the right times, all while feeling like I was watching someone else's wedding from far away. Even when we finally left the venue, driving through the quiet streets of the town I had grown up in, the silence between us was heavier than anything I had ever known. He held my hand, but not in the way he used to. His fingers pressed just a little too firmly, as if reminding me that he could tighten that grip whenever he wanted. I did not know then how many nights I would lie awake, replaying that moment in the corridor. How many times I would wish I had listened to that instinct that told me something was terribly wrong, That first shift in the air, that first crack in the facade, it was the warning. And though I didn't yet understand the full depth of what was coming, a part of me, deep and unspoken, was already bracing for the storm. My name is Evelyn Harper, and today I am 72 years old. I live in a small town tucked deep into the rolling hills of South Carolina, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and nothing stays a secret for long. The streets are lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss, their branches swaying gently in the humid summer breeze. It is the kind of town where the corner store still sells penny candy in glass jars, and where people wave to each other even if they have never met. My life here has always been simple and quiet, defined by the steady rhythm of routine. I work as a seamstress, my hands more comfortable with the feel of needle and thread than with any modern gadget. I spend hours bent over my work table, the sunlight streaming through lace curtains as I stitch hems and repair buttons for the same families I have known for decades. Before that night, I was known as the cheerful girl on Magnolia Street, the one who always had a fresh pot of sweet tea ready for whoever might drop by. My small home smelled of lavender sachets tucked into every drawer and cinnamon rolls baking in the oven on Saturday mornings. I loved slow walks to the market, chatting with the butcher about his children and the old ladies who sold homemade jams. I was content. My world was small, but it was safe, and I believed that was enough. I grew up in a modest household, the youngest of 3 sisters. My father worked long days at the lumber mill, his clothes always smelling faintly of sawdust and pine. My mother was a church-going woman who valued appearances above all else. She taught me to keep my head high, my voice soft, and my smile ready, no matter what I might be feeling inside. There was an unspoken rule in our family that private matters stayed private, and even as a child, I understood that meant you did not speak of your fears or your doubts. You endured, you adapted, and you presented the picture the world expected to see. It was in that environment that I learned to believe in fairy tales. I imagined love as something pure and gentle, the kind of devotion you see in black and white films, where the man tips his hat and the woman glows under his gaze. I carried those dreams into my teenage years, dreaming of a wedding day filled with laughter and music, of a home where love would live in every corner. I told myself I would marry someone who made me feel safe, someone who saw me as a treasure, not a burden. When I met Richard, it felt as though all those childhood fantasies had stepped out of my imagination and into the real world. He had a way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room. His voice was warm, steady, and every word seemed chosen to make me feel important. He would bring me flowers for no reason at all, leave little notes in my mailbox, and always open the door for me when we went anywhere together. People in town would say how lucky I was, and I believed them. We looked perfect from the outside. He had charm that could win over anyone, from my strict mother to the nosiest neighbor. He listened intently when people spoke, remembering small details and bringing them up weeks later as though they had been precious to him. He made me laugh, and I loved how easily I could lose track of time when we were together. I thought he was a man of substance, someone who would build a life with me based on mutual respect and care. Looking back, I realized how much I wanted to believe that he was the man I imagined. There was a comfort in the way he fit into my dreams, the way he seemed to align perfectly with the picture I had carried in my heart for so long. I told myself that finding him was proof that love stories did exist outside of the movies. That belief was intoxicating. It made me overlook things I should have noticed. It made me ignore the faint shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. The days leading up to our wedding were filled with joy. My sisters helped me choose the dress, white lace with small pearl buttons down the back. My friends hosted a bridal shower where we played silly games and shared stories late into the night. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, with sunny skies and a soft breeze the morning I woke up to marry him. My heart was light, my steps quick, and every glance in the mirror showed a woman who believed she was walking into the happiest chapter of her life. There was not a single part of me that suspected anything was wrong. My life, My upbringing and my dreams had all taught me to focus on the beauty of the moment, to hold tight to the good and push away anything that felt uncertain. It was easier to believe in the promise of forever than to question the man who had given me that promise. So I stood there, veil pinned carefully in place, bouquet trembling slightly in my hands, ready to take vows that I thought would protect me. What I did not know was that I was stepping into something far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. Looking back now, it feels almost unbelievable how many signs were there, quietly waving at me from the shadows. Yet I chose to look the other way. At the time, they did not feel like warnings. They felt like quirks, like harmless expressions of love, the kind that people laughed about in small towns. The first time I noticed something unusual, it was during a Sunday afternoon at the park. We had been sitting on a bench, sharing a sandwich, when a friend of mine from high school walked by and stopped to chat. She complimented my dress, asked about the wedding plans, and smiled politely at Richard. I thought nothing of it until I noticed how stiff his posture had become. The smile on his face was polite, but cold, and the moment she walked away, his hand tightened around mine, just enough to make me look at him. He asked me who she was, how well I knew her, and why she had been looking at me that way. I laughed it off, thinking he was just being protective, but inside, I felt a strange knot begin to form. There were other moments, small enough to dismiss at first, like the way he would call me unexpectedly in the middle of the day, asking where I was and who I was with. If I said I had stopped by the bakery, he wanted to know what I bought and whether I had spoken to anyone there. If I mentioned visiting my sister, he would ask what we talked about. It was not the curiosity of someone interested in my life. It was an inspection. But I told myself it was endearing, that it meant he cared. After all, weren't husbands supposed to be involved in their wives' lives? My friends began to notice before I did. One evening, over coffee, my closest friend leaned in and said she thought Richard might be a bit controlling. I laughed it off and defended him, insisting that he just had a strong personality and liked to be in charge. My mother, in her quiet way, hinted at the same thing, reminding me that marriage often changed men and that sometimes jealousy was just another word for love. I wanted to believe that, so I did. I had been raised to think that a man who guarded you closely was a man who valued you, but the truth was already revealing itself in ways I could not quite name. There was the time we were at a family barbecue, and my cousin, who had known me since childhood, put his arm around my shoulder while we laughed at an old story. I felt Richard's gaze on me before I even turned my head. His eyes were hard, unblinking, and when I moved away from my cousin, I could feel the tension in the air. Later, in the car, he asked why I had let another man touch me, even if it was family. His tone was calm, almost casual, but the message was sharp. There were other incidents that seemed so small they barely registered. Yet together, they began to weave a pattern. The way he would suggest what I should wear, always steering me toward outfits that covered more of my body. The way he would take my phone from my hand mid-conversation to see who I was texting. The way he would insist on driving me everywhere, even when I wanted to walk. Each time, I told myself it was love, that it was chivalry, that it was old-fashioned romance in a world that had forgotten how to care for someone. One particular evening stands out in my memory. We were at a small diner on the edge of town, a place with red leather booths and a jukebox that still worked. The waitress was young, probably not more than 18, and she smiled at me as she poured my coffee. She made a light-hearted joke about how lucky I was to have a man who looked at me the way Richard did. I smiled, but when I glanced at him, his face was unreadable. He waited until she walked away before saying quietly, "I don't like her talking to you like that." I remember blinking, confused, because she had barely spoken to me. That was when I realized that in his mind, every interaction I had with the outside world was something he measured, evaluated, and judged. I began to adjust myself without even realizing it. I spoke less when other men were around. I avoided conversations that might make him suspicious. I changed my clothes to avoid comments about modesty. I made sure to answer his calls immediately, even if I was busy, because I had learned that letting it ring too long would lead to questions. These adjustments felt natural at the time, as if I was simply becoming more considerate, more attentive to my future husband. It never occurred to me that I was slowly shrinking inside my own life. If there was a moment when I could have seen it clearly, it might have been the afternoon he showed up unannounced at my work. I was at my sewing table, fitting a dress for a customer when he walked in. He greeted the woman politely but stood so close behind me that I could feel his breath on my neck. He did not speak until she left, and then he said he had just wanted to make sure everything was going well. I smiled and told him it was, but the truth was that my hands had started to tremble as soon as I saw him in the doorway. There was something in the way he filled the room, something heavy and unyielding that I could not quite explain. At the time, I told myself all of it came from love, that he was simply more attentive than most men, more invested in me and our relationship. It was easier to believe that than to admit that I felt watched, measured, and contained. I did not understand yet that these were the first cracks in the world I thought I was building, the first shadows creeping into the light. What I saw as devotion was something entirely different, and it had already begun to change the way I moved, the way I spoke, the way I lived. The hallway felt longer than it really was, as if each step stretched it farther away from the noise and warmth of the reception. The dim light from the wall sconces cast long shadows that seemed to follow me, distorting with each movement. I could still hear the muffled music from the main hall, a slow, romantic song that only made the contrast sharper. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of old wood polish and the lingering sweetness of the flowers scattered throughout the venue. My fingers were wrapped tightly around the bouquet, the stems slick from the condensation of hours in my grip. I sensed him before I saw him. The steady sound of his shoes against the floorboards echoed in the narrow space, growing louder, more deliberate. When I turned, he was already close enough that I could see the sharp lines of his jaw in the dim light. His eyes were locked on me, no longer soft or warm, but fixed and assessing, as though I had done something wrong without even realizing it. He did not smile. There was no trace of the man who had been kissing me in front of our family just an hour ago. Without warning, his hand clamped around my arm. The lace of my sleeve did nothing to shield me from the heat of his grip. It was not the touch of a husband in love, but the kind of hold meant to keep something from moving away. His fingers dug in just enough for me to know I could not slip free without making a scene. I felt my stomach tighten, an instinctive reaction I could not control. He leaned in until his breath brushed against my cheek. The scent of wine mingled with his cologne, filling my senses. When he spoke, his voice was steady, calm even, but it carried a weight that pinned me in place. "Now that you are my wife," he said, "you will learn your obligations." Each word was deliberate, as if rehearsed, and they sank into me like cold steel. I stood frozen, unable to form a response, my mind rushing to catch up with the reality of what he had just said. The hallway seemed to press in around us, the edges of my vision narrowing as my pulse thudded in my ears. In that moment, time slowed. I became aware of every detail, the uneven texture of the wall behind me, the faint hum of the air conditioner somewhere down the corridor, the way the petals of my bouquet trembled in my shaking hands. His eyes never left mine, unblinking, holding me there as if testing how much resistance he would find. I wanted to tell myself it was a bad joke, that he was teasing in some misguided way, but there was no trace of humor in him. There was only certainty, the kind that comes from someone who already knows they are in control. When he finally let go, it was not with gentleness. The release was calculated, a quiet warning disguised as a casual movement. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching him walk back toward the reception hall without so much as a glance over his shoulder. My breath came in shallow bursts, and the weight of what had just happened pressed against my chest like a stone. I could still feel the imprint of his fingers on my arm, a ghost of his grip that would linger long after the marks faded. I did not follow him immediately. I stood there in the half-light of that hallway, trying to piece together the shift that had just occurred. I thought about how only hours before I had been walking down the aisle toward him, full of trust and hope. I thought about the man who had promised me love and protection, The man who had smiled at me in front of everyone we knew, and I realized that I was not sure where that man had gone, or if he had ever been real at all. When I finally returned to the reception, the room looked the same as it had before, but it no longer felt like a place I belonged. The laughter was too loud, the smiles too wide, and every pair of eyes seemed to hold a question I could not answer. I smiled when people spoke to me, posed for photographs, and nodded politely at conversations I did not hear. All the while I could feel him watching me from across the room, his gaze steady and unreadable, a silent reminder of the words he had just spoken. As the night wore on, I tried to bury the unease under the motions of celebration. I danced with guests, cut the cake, and thanked everyone for coming. But the memory of that hallway stayed with me, a shadow over every moment. Even when we left the venue and stepped out into the quiet streets, the cool night air could not wash away the heaviness in my chest. Sitting beside him in the car, I felt his hand cover mine, the gesture almost tender, yet the pressure of his fingers made it clear that tenderness was not the point. The silence between us was thick, filled with the weight of something unspoken. Streetlights flickered past in long, slow stretches, casting fleeting patterns across his face. I kept my eyes on the window, watching the dark shapes of trees and houses slip by, trying to convince myself that I was imagining the shift in him. But deep down, beneath the layers of denial I clung to, I knew the truth. Something had changed in that hallway, and whatever it was not going to change back. The days after the wedding felt like stepping into a house where every window had been nailed shut. At first it was subtle, almost invisible to anyone looking in from the outside. Richard spoke to me in the same steady tone, smiled at the neighbors, and went to work every morning as usual. But inside our home, the air was different. There was a constant undercurrent, a sense that every movement I made was being measured and catalogued. He began to call them house rules, though they were never written down. They existed in the pauses between his words, in the way he would look at me when I did something he disapproved of. One of the first changes was the way visitors were handled. Friends who had always stopped by unannounced began to find the door locked, even during the day. If someone knocked, Richard would answer before I had the chance, and often he would tell them I was busy, even when I wasn't. He said we needed privacy, that the first months of marriage were sacred, but it felt less like privacy and more like isolation. Calls from my sisters became shorter and less frequent because he would stand nearby when I spoke, pretending to do something else, but clearly listening to every word. The control extended to the smallest details of daily life. If I went to the grocery store, I was expected to bring back a receipt and account for every item in the bag. If I bought something that was not on the list he had written, there would be a quiet interrogation about why it was necessary. He had opinions on what I wore, too. Dresses that had once been his favorites were suddenly labeled too revealing. Even in the sweltering summer heat of South Carolina, he would insist that I wear cardigans or long sleeves when we went out. I told myself it was just his traditional nature, that he wanted to protect me. But there was no mistaking the way his eyes followed me if I adjusted my clothes or greeted someone in public. Nights were the most difficult. He had a habit of pacing the house before bed, checking the locks on the doors and windows, peering through the blinds as though expecting someone to be outside. If I asked what he was doing, he would simply say, "Making sure everything is in order." But his expression told another story. It was not about safety. It was about control. I began to dread the sound of his footsteps in the hallway after dark, the way they would pause outside whatever room I was in. There were moments when the tension broke through in small, unsettling bursts. One evening, I accidentally left the laundry in the washer overnight, and by morning, the clothes smelled musty. When he discovered them, he did not raise his voice, but he stared at me for a long time before saying in an even tone, "If you cannot handle simple things, what else will you fail at?" Another time, I served dinner 10 minutes later than usual, and he sat at the table in silence until I placed the plate in front of him. Then he stood up, swept the plate onto the floor, and walked away without a word. I was left on my knees cleaning the mess, the smell of gravy and broken ceramic filling the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the sponge. It was not just what he did, but the unpredictability of it. I began to live in a state of constant readiness, scanning his face for clues about his mood, adjusting my words and actions to avoid triggering something I could not take back. If his voice was calm, I held my breath, because sometimes calm was worse than anger. Calm meant he was thinking, deciding what the consequence would be. I learned to count his footsteps when he moved from room to room, the creak of certain floorboards becoming my warning system. One afternoon stands out in my memory with painful clarity. I had been sewing a hem for a customer when I heard the sound of the front door unlocking earlier than usual. My first thought was that something had happened at work, but when he stepped inside, he said nothing. He just looked around the room, at the fabric on the table, the unfinished stitches, and then at me. I asked if everything was all right, and his reply was a simple, "I just wanted to see what you were doing." He stood there for several minutes without speaking, watching me work, and when he finally left the room, my hands were trembling so badly that I had to redo the stitches. The walls of our home began to feel closer, the rooms smaller. I started to avoid certain things I used to enjoy, like going for evening walks or sitting on the porch with a book. It was easier not to ask for time alone than to deal with the questions that would follow. Even my laughter changed. Around him it became quieter, shorter, as if too much joy might provoke suspicion. Through it all, I told myself that I could manage it, that I could find ways to keep the peace. But the truth was that the peace was an illusion, something that only existed when I was willing to erase parts of myself to make room for his control. It was a slow erosion, the kind you do not notice until one day you realize you have disappeared in your own life. By the time I began to see it clearly, the fear was no longer just in my mind. It lived in my body, in the way my shoulders tensed at the sound of his keys in the door, in the way I rehearsed answers in my head before speaking, in the way my breath caught when his eyes fixed on me for too long. It was a cool morning when everything shifted. I remember waking up to the sound of birds outside my window, their song muffled by the heaviness in my chest. The night before had been quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your ears long after the lights go out. Richard had left early for work, and the house felt different without his presence pressing into the walls. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, my hands moving on autopilot, when I heard a soft knock at the door. Through the glass, I saw Margaret, my neighbor from 2 houses down. She was a kind woman in her 60s, with warm eyes and a way of speaking that made you feel safe. She held a pie dish in her hands, her smile gentle but tinged with something else. I opened the door, and before I could even greet her properly, her eyes flicked to the bruises on my arm. They weren't fresh, but they were dark enough to tell a story I had not spoken aloud. She didn't ask the obvious questions. Instead, she handed me the pie, touched my hand softly, and said in a voice low enough for only me to hear, "If you ever need to leave, I'll help you." The words sank into me like sunlight through a crack in the blinds. For a moment I just stood there, pie in hand, heart racing. No one had ever acknowledged what was happening, not in such a direct way. I mumbled a thank you, closed the door, and stood in the hallway staring at the floor. That night, I thought about her words. They looped in my mind over and over until they became something more than an offer. They became a plan. I started noticing small opportunities I had never let myself consider before. Times when he left the house without taking my keys. Times when I could slip out without being noticed. I began keeping my important documents hidden in a place he would never look, behind a loose panel in the closet. I packed a small bag, nothing that would draw suspicion, just enough to keep me afloat if I had to run. The chance came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday afternoon, and he called to say he would be working late. My heart pounded as I retrieved the bag, slipped on my coat, and walked quickly to Margaret's house. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply opened the door wider and ushered me in, locking it behind me. There was tea waiting on the stove, and she sat me down at the table as if this had been planned all along. From there, she drove me to her niece's home in another town. I remember watching the streets change through the car window, the familiar buildings fading into roads I didn't recognize. Each mile put more distance between me and the life I was leaving behind. When we arrived, I stepped inside a small but warm living room, the scent of fresh bread in the air. For the first time in months, I exhaled without feeling like I had to measure the sound of my own breathing. The first few nights were the hardest. My body was still wired to listen for the sound of his footsteps, to brace for the weight of his presence in a doorway. I would wake up in the dark, heart pounding until I realized I was safe. Slowly, the tension began to fade. I started helping around the house, mending clothes, cooking meals. I found work at a small tailor shop, and with each stitch I sewed, I felt a little more like myself again. There were moments of grief too, for the years I had lost, for the version of me that had been silenced. But there was also a quiet joy in rediscovering things I had been forced to set aside. I laughed more freely. I sang while I worked. I sat in the sun without worrying about who might be watching. Now, when I walk through my days, I carry the memory of that girl who once stood frozen in a dim hallway, bouquet trembling in her hands. She did not know how she would survive, but she did. She found a way out. And if you are listening to this and see even a shadow of your own life in my story, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not overreacting, and you are not alone. There is a way out, even if it feels impossible to see right now. I am grateful to every person who has listened to my story, because telling it means it is no longer just mine to carry. It belongs to anyone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that freedom is worth the risk, and that there is life beyond the walls someone else tries to build around you. Thank you for giving me your time, your ears, and your heart. If you want to continue walking this path with me, there is another story waiting for you right now on the screen. Click it. Keep listening, because the more we share, the harder it becomes for the silence to win.